Hey everyone, Brendan Sander here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to a solo album ranking for none other than Iron Maiden frontman Bruce Dickinson. So arguably one of the most famous frontmen in all of music, as well as one of the biggest metal bands around the world. And what's also interesting is that Bruce isn't just a frontman. He's also a commercial airline pilot. He even flies the band around the world when they're on tour. And, having just released his seventh solo album, the Mandrake Project, on March 1st of 2024, I decided it's time to do an album ranking of his, covering the solo albums that he's done over the last 34 years at this point. So I'm going to rank each one. I'll count them down. We'll do that here in just a bit. But before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things do help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you turn on notifications, hey, you're going to stay up to date on really cool episodes just like this with a solo album ranking for Iron Maiden frontman Bruce Dickinson. All right, so as I said, 7 total solo albums that he's released. And we're going to kick off here, obviously, at number 7 with Tyranny of Souls from 2005. 6th solo album for him at the time. It's produced by Roy Z, who at this point, 2024, has worked with him for the last 30 years. Pretty amazing. It's the first album to be released by Bruce Dickinson since he had returned to Iron Maiden at that time in 1999. And now also, up until just the release of the Mandrake Project, it's been 2 decades between album releases. So for a long time, this was the very last album or last solo album that we had from Bruce Dickinson. And this one here did not feature Adrian Smith, Iron Maiden guitar player, on it the way that Bruce's last 2 solo albums had featured Adrian Smith, Accident of Birth in 1997 and The Chemical Wedding in 1998. So this one, for me at least, is coming in last place, just in that, for me, I kind of find it a bit monotonous and repetitive in terms of the song style that's on this. It kind of all sounds the same to me. It's not really, if you get into it and give it a deep listen, but it is one of those things that the songs have never resonated. They've never lived with me, making me want to go back to it, and they don't really stand out in my head. So even though when I do put the album on, I do like it. It is typical Bruce Dickinson in some ways and manner. It just isn't one of those ones that really resonates with me, and hence the reason it's coming in last place. And I have to say, I'm really glad that this is not the last solo album that Bruce is releasing. We now have something later than this one here to sink our teeth into, which I'll talk more about when we get to that one in this countdown. All right, coming in at number 6, The Chemical Wedding from 1998. This was his 5th solo album at the time, produced by Roy Z, featuring the 2nd appearance from Iron Maiden guitarist Adrian Smith on this one. Now, following the release of this album here, both Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith would return to Iron Maiden, which, of course, at that time we were all over the moon about and just beside ourselves. This album here was an interesting one. It drew inspiration from poet William Blake and featured some of his works incorporated into the songs here, whether it be poetry reading or lyrical style. Eventually, 10 years after the release of this album in 2008, a movie would be released, the same name, written by Bruce Dickinson. I think he may have even played a role in the movie as well. But except for containing the title track, The Chemical Wedding, the storyline of the movie was actually about the reincarnation of Aleister Crowley, who is an English occultist and philosopher. So didn't really follow the storyline of what was the album, but I did find interesting that you do have a movie to go along with these 2 things. Certainly, and just one more thing that I have, found to be interesting of Bruce Dickinson. Talked about him being frontman for one of the biggest bands in the world and being a commercial airline pilot, which is a lot harder to do than just getting your regular pilot's license. So, he can fly around people and take care of their safety and all of that. He's also a script writer and movie star and movie producer, and you name it, Bruce has done a lot. So definitely the Renaissance man, if you will. All right, coming in at number 5 is his latest album, the Mandrake Project. 2024 release, just came out on March 1st. 7th solo album, again produced by Roy Z. And this is where I was talking about, Roy having spent, the 30 years now working with him since 1994. This one here, the Mandrake Project, being a concept album, also with tie-in to the release of this, is a 10-part comic book or graphic novel. Eventually, I'm sure they'll gather it all up. And so you're introduced to those characters through this, because this release, the deluxe edition at least, also came with a prequel comic and preview of that upcoming 10-part series. So we get introduced to the characters Dr. Necropolis, who's the main character and on quest for the Mandrake Project, Leah, his girlfriend, and Shaman, who is an evildoer trying to prevent Necropolis from getting to the Mandrake Project. Now, both the 7-inch single Afterglow of Ragnarok and the album itself have that preview comic, so if you don't want to repeat it, you can just buy the standalone CD edition of it, not this deluxe edition one here. But I have to say, I find this album to be really interesting. As I said, I thought it was a lot better than Tyranny of Souls. There's a lot more variety on it, and just a lot more interest in terms of the overall music and lyrical style of what it is. Aside from even being a concept album, I think the songs stand alone very well. And sometimes, unfortunately, with concept albums, in order to get that storyline across, I think the songs themselves can suffer, but not in this case. I think the album is set up very well and flows very nicely, still telling us the story and getting us into it, but not relying solely on that to be a strong album, which is why, at least for me, it's coming in at number 5. All right, number 4, Balls to Picasso, 1994, 2nd solo album. I always thought that was such a weird name for an album. I have no idea what was the real thought behind it. I'm sure he has talked about it and it's out there, but for me at least, just strange title to say the least. Now, first album that was recorded with Roy Z, Tribe of Gypsies. He had an entirely different sound for this album than previous solo album, the debut Tattooed Millionaire, which is much more of a hard rock sound. This one here was a full-on heavy, I don't really want to even say heavy metal because we hadn't quite gotten to that yet, but it was just a very heavy sounding album that was different than the more rock sounding. So it was sort of, Tattooed Millionaire jumped to this one here and it was kind of strange, and it didn't really tie in with the Iron Maiden sound either, which is another thing that I've always really appreciated about Bruce Dickinson, is that he doesn't rely on replicating the Iron Maiden sound solo. And he had always created the solo stuff as a way to venture outside of the Iron Maiden sound. And so even when he does do Maiden style sounding songs, they're outside of the wheelhouse of the straight ahead Maiden sound. And I have to say, I do appreciate that, so we can kind of keep Maiden separate from what it is that he does solo. But this one here, I also found interesting in that if you want to know why the album is so varied and different from Tattooed Millionaire, it's because there's actually a whole other album that was recorded in between this with producer Keith Olsen, who's known for working with bands like Journey, Fleetwood Mac, Heart. So a much more sort of pop direction. And not that the music was pop, but it was just very well produced and more in the rock vein like Tattooed Millionaire. Ultimately, Bruce decided he didn't really want to go in that direction and they shifted towards this. But that album, or those songs at least, did get released on the 2 CD deluxe edition reissues that happened in the late 90s. So if you want to know what that sounds like, you can pick up this album and you get the other album, which has some songs that repeat between them, but most of them are very different. So a lot of unreleased Bruce Dickinson on that second album, which is very, very cool. All in all, I gotta say, there's some real standout songs on this album here. One of my absolute favorite songs, besides the single Tears of the Dragon, which was kind of odd to release a ballad as your first and main single from it, although absolutely killer and probably the best track. But I really like the song Change of Heart that was on here. And that song in and of itself, I always thought deserved a bit more attention than it got at the time, but definitely worth checking out if you're not familiar with the album. Okay, next up, coming in at number 3, we've got Skunk Works from 1996. Third solo album at the time. This one here, not recorded with Roy Z. It was recorded with his touring band from the tour that was the Balls to Picasso tour. He brought those people into the studio, and then he worked with Jack Endino instead of Roy Z. And Jack Endino, known from the grunge world with the band Skin Yard, he's the guitar player for them, but he worked with bands like Soundgarden, Nirvana. So obviously a very different sound, more of an alternative hard rock, so less of the metal sound from Balls to Picasso, more of the rock sound from Tattooed Millionaire, but moving in the alternative rock direction. And I think a lot of people, I don't know if they didn't like it at the time, but are not as big a fan of this album today. And I have to say, after this album, which I thought was kind of a bummer at the time, this album I thought was stellar. And so obviously it's why it's coming in at number 3 for me. And I've always loved this album ever since, even though it is quite different than any Bruce Dickinson album that he's done otherwise. This one here, I just thought was fantastic. Right away from the opening track, Space Race, into Back from the Edge, the second track, and third, Inertia. I mean, the album just seared for me. It was fantastic. And I still love this. Why it's making my top 3. All right, coming in at number 2, Accident of Birth, 1997, his 4th solo album at the time. First to feature Iron Maiden guitar player Adrian Smith, who was a former Iron Maiden guitar player at that time. So you had Bruce, who was out of the band. You had Adrian, who was out of the band, coming back together. And this album here, markedly different than the 3 previous solo albums that we had from Bruce Dickinson. This one being a return to form in the sense of coming the closest to sounding like Iron Maiden music. And considering Iron Maiden didn't really sound like Iron Maiden at this time either, it was such a breath of fresh air at that time. So interesting that Bruce did that, because he had moved away from, starting the solo stuff to get away from that. But because there was nothing out there sounding like it, it was still different than anything that was going on. And, people went nuts for this. So with Adrian Smith coming back into the fold, I think this was the album that set up the return of Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith to Iron Maiden, because the people went mad with, fever of these two guys being back together. And I think Iron Maiden took note of that and said, geez, they're sounding great. They're doing that sound that we started. And it led to ultimately in 1999, the guys getting back together. But this album here was just absolutely amazing at the time. Everything on here is fantastic, from opening number Freak. I always liked the second song on here, Arrival, and Star Children was really good. But title track, Accident of Birth, and Man of Sorrows, The Magician, you name it, they all sound great. They sound like killer Iron Maiden songs. And, that's why it's coming in at number 2. All right, let's cover the number 1 solo album from Bruce Dickinson, Tattooed Millionaire, from 1990, his debut solo album. Yes, it may be the least metal of all of his albums, but at the same time, I think it's the best. I think it's the best tracks. It really shows Bruce doing something different outside of Iron Maiden. So he released this while still in the band. And the cool thing was it features future Iron Maiden guitarist Janet Gears, who took over for Adrian Smith. So during the solo time of Bruce Dickinson, he had a future Iron Maiden guitar player and he had a former Iron Maiden guitar player in the fold. And who knows, if one of the guitar players ever goes down, maybe Roy Z will take their place and we'll have another future Iron Maiden guitarist in the fold of the solo work from Bruce Dickinson. You never know. But this album here actually started in a very interesting way. Bruce Dickinson was asked to contribute a song to the horror film A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, which ultimately he wrote the future Iron Maiden hit Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. But Iron Maiden decided that song was way too good to be relegated to a soundtrack and decided to release it themselves. So not even as a Bruce Dickinson solo song, but becoming an Iron Maiden song, and of course them having a hit with that song. But it led to Bruce deciding to record a whole album and do something fundamentally different and outside of Iron Maiden. So much more in the rock and the hard rock vein than the metal sounds of Maiden. And it was very successful upon release, giving them two top 40, or Bruce, I should say, two top 40 songs in the title track, Tattooed Millionaire and All the Young Dudes, which was the Mott the Hoople song written by David Bowie. But there's so many other good songs that are on this thing. I always like the third track on here, Born in 58, the song Dive, 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 which they had a live home video come out that was called Live, Live, Live to play on that. Zulu, Lulu, No More Lies, really good stuff. And the album from start to finish, again, even though not the Iron Maiden sound, Bruce made it his own. It's great hearing Bruce performing these songs and doing something that was different like this. All in all, making this album here my favorite of the Bruce Dickinson solo catalog. And so there you go. That is my Bruce Dickinson solo album ranking. I hope you guys enjoyed me running through all 7 of his solo albums, including latest album, The Mandrake Project, for which I have done a full review. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. I've also done a full Iron Maiden album ranking, and I'll leave that one, link for that in the description as well. And you can continue on with your Bruce Dickinson and Iron Maiden fill with those other great, fantastic videos. All right, everyone, let me know your thoughts. What's your #1 Bruce Dickinson solo album release? And we'll have a great conversation about that. All right, everyone, take care. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.